These are some common mistakes that people often make when they are planning out their garden, especially when you're adding in perennials. So you want to really look at the layout, not only of your yard, but paying attention to how the sun and your light travels over. And oftentimes people are putting in new garden beds, putting in perennials and plants in wintertime or really early spring, not thinking about once we're in summer and the sun, if you live in a northern area like we do, the sun will be much higher in the sky. But things that are surrounding, if you have trees that are bare right now and don't have their leaves on, then you've got more sunlight that's actually coming through in the winter and early spring months than you will in full summer. So really paying attention to your surroundings and how those are affected by the different seasons. So for example, when we first moved on to our homestead in 2006, that spring and summer, which was 2007, we went and bought a whole bunch of bare root fruit trees and we planted them in the ground. It was about March. Well, the problem with that is we planted all of them about where that high tunnel is, right here along the fence line. And at that time we had a bunch of maple trees. The maple trees we took out in order to increase pasture. But the problem was I had a lot of winter sun coming through. Those fruit trees were in glorious full sun in March. Well, once the maples leafed out and we hit June, which is when the blossoms were beginning to turn into fruit or would be, they were in shade almost all of the day throughout all of the summer months. So they really struggled to grow. They weren't doing very well, which means the following 2 years, and we realized that they weren't growing and they were really struggling due to that shade. So we had to move them. Well, by that time, their roots had grown. The trees had gotten a little bit bigger, but not much. And so we had to dig all of them up, hope that they didn't get damaged or shocked too much during transplanting. And we definitely lost a year. It took another year because most of your fruit trees between 5 to 7 years old before they start to produce fruit. It set them back another year. So we had to wait another year extra before we actually got fruit off of the fruit trees. But we moved said fruit trees. This is actually some of them here, my original ones, which are now quite big. You can see this guy here. This was one of the apple trees. So we had to move them, and that's all these big ones here. I've got these apple trees, cherry, and plums. So we then moved them over here, knowing that they would actually be in full sun all year round. And now I get massive harvests. They're doing great, are very well established, but I would have been able to get fruit a whole year earlier had we not made that mistake and then had to go through all the work of moving all of those trees. So that is really big. We also want to make sure that when we're placing them, as we are now, because my sun, that's my southern exposure, so my sun rises in that direction and it goes all the way here until it settles down into the west. So with the way that the sun travels, I need to make sure when these are leafed out that these aren't actually shading my vegetable garden, which they're not. So definitely want to keep an eye on the way that the sun travels and the way that the shadows and all of that for where you live, and track that out to make sure that you're not accidentally putting something in that's then going to impact things that are next to it. Some of the other things that you want to keep in mind is, are you close to your watering source? So not as important with fruit trees, though the first year that you plant them, if you're not getting an inch of rainfall every week, then you are going to be wanting to water them once a week throughout the first year until you hit the winter months. So really important, because a lot of times people will plant them in the winter. And if you're wanting to learn how to plant fruit trees correctly so they get fruit for years to come, you can go and watch this video. And we'll also have the link below. But a lot of times people think, oh, I planted it in March, I'll water it for the first few months, and then they get into July and August, which is usually the hottest time of the year for us, and then they don't water them, and then in the spring, it looks like the tree's okay. Sometimes it'll die, but then it doesn't come back the following spring, and it's usually because it wasn't watered all the way through that first year. So you definitely want to make sure that you've got your gardens. This is one of our main vegetable gardens, and you can see we actually have a overhead sprinkler in this one. I don't have soaker hoses set up in this garden yet. You can see it's up on that T-post there. and we have a water source right on the end of the house there. So I can easily run a hose, or like when I'm watering the fruit trees, usually by hand, I can stretch the hose all the way out, fill up my watering little bucket, and put a gallon on each of those fruit trees. Relatively easy. I'm not having to pack it quite as far because we're close to our water source. Some of the other things is if you have got, this is especially true with putting in berry plants or perennials, meaning you're ideally planting them once and they're going to come back year after year. So that is putting like things together that have the same type of soil needs. So we have got, here's an asparagus bed, which right now is just in dormancy. You can see this was last year's one of them that I let them fern. But all of this here I've got is asparagus. But over there, I have got our blueberries and our raspberries, and you can't actually see it right now. But in between my blueberry plants, I have rhubarb. So one, these are all perennial plants, but most importantly, they all have high acidity soil needs. So rhubarb and blueberries and raspberries all need to have more acidic soil, their pH level, than a vegetable garden in order to thrive. So I've got these near one another because when I need to amend this soil, it's really easy for me to apply my elemental sulfur, to apply my wood chips and my compost and everything. They all have the same similar needs. So that way I can just do this all in one swatch rather than having different plants and only trying to do a little bit of the soil. So I found it's easier if you can group things together that have similar growing needs. And also, I've got these rows close enough that I can take the wheelbarrow and just go right between them in order to do any of the amendments that we need to do. And then there's still enough space to get the lawnmower through to cut the grass clippings during the summer months when we're in our growing period. Other things you want to take into consideration is proximity to the house. So obviously, if you're planting fruit trees, which are going to get large eventually, you don't want to have them too close to the house. You don't want to have any trees too close to the house, but you do want to have most of your garden beds, if possible, relatively close to the house. Because one, when you're cooking and going out and harvesting, it's much easier to just run out and grab something if it's not, way off on the back piece of the property. And secondly, if it's close to the house, you're going to be seeing the plants in the garden area upon entering and leaving the house. And really the key to your garden is you being present in there and noticing problems and issues right as they crop up. Plus, part of the reason that we grow a garden is to enjoy it. So the closer it is to the house, the more likelihood that you are going to be enjoying that said space. Now, some of the other questions that I get asked a lot are what way to run your beds or to plant things. Should the rows be north to south? Should they be east to west? And honestly, that really doesn't matter that much. What matters is what are you planting in the beds? What's going to be tall and grow tall that might shade things that are behind it or beside it, depending upon how the sun travels over. So it's more important, like here, these beds are actually going from east to west. And I've got garlic. Hey, get out of the bed. I've got garlic planted in here. And then I actually have some onion seeds that I just sowed under this high tunnel. We'll see if we can get them to germinate. It's a little bit early right now. But the reason that I say that is because it doesn't really matter if I were to have planted the garlic going north to south, even though we did it in long rows. What matters more is knowing my sun is this direction. And so the garlic is up here, which garlic doesn't get that tall. So it's not going to shade whatever is planted back here. However, if I had planted something like corn or pole beans that do get really tall, then I would potentially be shading whatever was grown back here. So if we did want to grow a crop like that, it would be important that we put it at the back so that it's at the very back. It's not shading anything. The shorter things are up front. So that's more important than really the direct orientation. It all has to do with the light and how tall the crops get that you're planting and just making sure that you're not shading things you don't want to shade. However, sometimes you want to take advantage of that. So for example, if you are planting something like pole beans or something that grows up like that in the heat of summer when it's really hot, you can take advantage and underneath it where it is more shady, or if it is going to be blocking something behind it, that's where you could plant things that don't mind a little bit cooler. So you would have things like in the brassica family, like cabbage or Swiss chard or beets even, that don't mind a little bit cooler. So you can use it to your advantage one way or the other. You just want to make sure that you're really thinking about it and doing it on purpose. If you want more step-by-step tutorials and instructions, all from planning your garden to planting, crop rotation, companion planting, and then harvesting, cooking, preserving, you, my friend, want to make sure that you are on the wait list for the Pioneering Today Academy, which is my Homestead membership, when we open the doors for the first time this year on March 23rd. There's a link below. You can go and get on that wait list.